All right, hello, welcome back. It's super nice to see everyone. We are back at it with the second talk of the RI seminar, fall 2025. It is my great pleasure to introduce our very own Aran Nayebi. Aran is a assistant professor here at CMU, specifically in the machine learning department, but he also has an appointment in the Neuroscience and Robotics Institutes. Aran runs the NeuroAgents lab. This lab works at the intersection of neuroscience and AI, and the goal is to reverse engineer animal embodied intelligence and build the next generation of autonomous agents responsibly and safely. That's going to be the theme of today's talk. Before joining CNU, Aran was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT, and before that did a PhD in neurosciences at Stanford. With that, I'm going to let Aran take the stage.
Good. Thanks, Andy and Levina, for inviting me. It's great to be here. As the title of my talk suggests, it will be using embodied agents to reverse engineer natural intelligence. And in particular, I've highlighted two words that are going to kind of thematically show up over and over throughout this talk. One is embodied, and the other is natural. And so the first thing I want to do is try to motivate why I chose that word choice to begin with. So let's begin with embody. And perhaps, especially to this audience, I don't need to convince anybody that current AI struggles to understand the physical world, but it might be helpful to ground ourselves in an example. Perhaps many of you are familiar with OpenAI's Sora model. In the past year since this came out, I think I used this actually in one of my job talks here. So in the past year, there's been a plethora of these generative models, generative world models. In particular, the way at least Sora in particular works is you enter in a text prompt of what video you want to be generated, and then out comes this really cool thing, right? A really cool video. So one example of such a video back when it came out is as follows. So you see here people are like digging in the sand, and then all of a sudden this chair kind of like appears out of nowhere, and then kind of incidentally, like, people are touching it, but it's like floating and like a weird, and then it like deforms in there's this like weird force that's controlling it. It's like has nothing to do with how hands actually interact with objects, etc. So it's incredibly photorealistic, by the way, and I think this is like one of the great benefits of pre-training data scale. But it's not physically realistic. I think, one question we can actually ask is, what's missing? And there can be many hypotheses for what this might be, maybe more data, keep the same type of model. But what I'm going to try to make the argument for is that, this kind of pre-training paradigm of large data set with an unembodied kind of machine learner that's trained on massive amounts of data is maybe just the beginning, but it's not maybe the end. And in fact, what you kind of need in combination with a scale, of course, is an additional kind of outer loop of embodied agency and interaction to really kind of complete the loop of real physical understanding. Yeah. So the next question is like the other part of my slide title, which is natural intelligence. So where does that come in, and why might that be relevant? Besides it being kind of cool to make statements about brains, could there be some kind of intelligence usefulness that comes from doing so? Well, one kind of point of view is that animals and humans, at least currently, perform behaviors we've yet to successfully engineer in autonomous AI agents. And here I've listed a few of them: prediction and planning, adaptive motor control, autonomy, and online lifelong learning. And the words I've highlighted in red are probably like maybe key ingredients to get there. So for example, requiring a world model, requiring memory. Both of these are, as we saw, the world model, for example, is still an unsolved problem. Memory for agents is as well, especially in high-dimensional video streams that kind of exceed the context length of very large models. Adaptive motor control, of course, requires embodiment. We don't yet have generalist robots. And the autonomy and lifelong learning, which is a theme I'll touch on, especially towards the end of the talk, is you can kind of view what we see as test-time reasoning right now in models as just the beginning of this sort of thing, where really the key thing and the key thing that brains can do is they can adapt their weights to learn new things, but without forgetting everything for their entire identity, which is something that happens if you backprop to the whole network. So really the goal, the kind of like spirit of the approach that we take here is that it's the capabilities that I'm listing here above that actually become concrete engineering targets that we're going to work towards. So it's not like we're going to look at a brain and try to look at how one neuron connects to another and try to back infer how everything works. That's just too hard, and brains are too complex. And they've been evolved for billions of years for this to really be as scrutable to humans as we would like it to be. You know, brains didn't evolve to be understandable in human natural language. They evolved to work. However, the capabilities of the brain allow us to set these as goals, as concrete goals that we want to work towards to build, truly lifelong learning autonomous agents. And what's kind of interesting is that there is actually a relationship between the task and like doing well on an AI task and actually predicting brain responses as a byproduct. So in other words, even if you didn't care about the brain, you actually might end up producing a model that is probably a better theory of how the brain works than prior approaches. So to give a canonical example in vision, people kind of recorded from the visual ventral pathways, so where images start at the retina and then proceed down V1, V4, and inferior temporal cortex where object categorization judgments are read out. And they recorded in macaques, and then they trained CNNs to do better and better on ImageNet. Right? So every dot here is a model that's trained on ImageNet. And then the other axis is how well does this ImageNet optimize CNNs, internal representations that are purely optimized to do well on the categorization task, how well do they linearly predict neural response patterns in this visual pathway in the primate? So it wasn't optimized to match the brain, but what was interesting is that as it got better and better at the task, it also became a better and better model of brain responses. So there's a kind of representational convergence between doing an AI goal down here, just improving ImageNet categorization accuracy, and the neuroscience goal of just being a faithful predictor of neural population responses. So you could ask, well, did people just get lucky? Is this an accident? And maybe the talk would end here if it was. Maybe what I'll kind of illustrate briefly is that there's actually like a principle of task optimization that consists of 4 ingredients: an architecture, a task, a data set, and a learning rule. And that actually each of these ingredients has analogs, quite physical analogs to things we look at in neuroscience as well. So you can think of the architecture you're using, like let's say the CNN or a transformer, as the way that your hypothesis for the circuit neuroanatomy, how the neurons are actually wired together. You can think of the task that you trained the neural network on as the ecological niche, and the data set as the kind of environment or ecological diet, the sensory stream that the organism takes or artificial organism takes. And then the learning rule is a kind of proxy for both natural selection and development to kind of quickly get you to the adult state of the organism. And in fact, it's the confluence of these 4 ingredients that gives us a neural network that we then actually regress to the brain and check how well it can do before refining our hypotheses. So there's kind of this two-way leap. And so the basic kind of theme is to design ML algorithms that are optimized to perform the organism's behavior under the same constraints that the organism faces. And this yields turns out, because if you can actually predict the brain quite well in silico, you can actually use this to run new experiments on. Running real experiments I don't have to tell roboticists this, but in general, like ML people, it's useful for them to know that running real neuroscience experiments is very costly and terrible. And so it's nice to have this kind of cheap thing that is a predictor of held out data. And then the other is coming in a deeper scientific reason is it kind of tells you the principles of why we even see these neural responses as they are. So in other words, if we see a neural network that's optimized for a task and it predicts neural population response as well, that's a strong hypothesis that maybe that was the kind of ecological niche the brain was optimized to do well over a large-scale evolutionary time. And in fact, there's a notion in this field, this intersection of neuroscience and AI, called the contravariance principle, which was put forth by Rosa Chow and Daniel Yeomans at Stanford, where the basic idea was that as you did a harder and harder task, there were kind of fewer and fewer solutions that emerge to be able to solve that task well. So, for example, if I hadn't picked ImageNet, if I had picked, I don't know, MNIST or barcode reading, it's not going to actually end up predicting the brain well. So you do have to pick a challenging, ethologically relevant task. And then as you do so, what ends up happening is that because the space of possible solutions narrows, and you're solving this in the same direction of tasks that the brain had to solve, you get, with high probability, you get some overlap with the brain as a result. So that's the underlying principle. It's called contravariance, because you're ruling out the number of possible solutions and really constraining them, and as a byproduct, get an overlap with the brain. Now, maybe the term you might be most familiar with is, which is related in AI, is called the Platonic representation hypothesis. So this is the same thing. It's just saying that there's fewer solutions to solve multiple tasks. So it's kind of like the AI version of contravariance. It doesn't say anything about a mapping onto the brain. But again, the brain is an intelligent system just like any other system. So it makes sense that the two are sort of facing the same thing. And so a nice quote that I like is, nothing in biology makes sense in light of evolution. A related quote is, nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of behavior. And maybe our credo is, nothing in maybe computational neuroscience makes sense except in the light of caste optimization. We're basically simulating evolution in silico and finding that there's strong overlap as we start to solve harder and harder AI problems. A natural question is, just before I kind of go into the results here, just to step back a bit, is what does it even mean to be good as a good model of the brain? So in other words, you can define a metric like, say, the ability to linearly regress these units onto real biological response patterns, and continue to hill climb on that metric. But natural question is like, what is the ceiling of that metric? Is it 1? Or what should it be even to begin with? And so we had a paper that came out that was just a perspective on the culmination of kind of this area of research over the past 10 years called the NeuroAI Turing test, where basically in a nutshell, the answer is we want models to be as good as models of the brain as two brains are to each other. So you define a metric. Brains have variability too, right? If you take my brain and your brain, even if we're seeing the same thing, even if you correct for the stochasticity in our brains, actually you can show there's still evolutionary variability. It's not going to be perfect. So whatever your metric is, your model should be as good, at least as two brains are to each other. And the reason why it's called a Turing test is simply because, not that anyone in AI really takes the Turing test seriously, but it's more of like a symbolic thing that we often look at behavior, right? So we often are convinced that an AI agent is doing something intelligent if you and I can't kind of distinguish it from a human, right? And the NeuroAI Turing test is simply saying, well, what we care about is actually, by doing behavior, we also get the internal representations back. And so it's not just the behavior alone is sufficient. We also want to show that the internals are not only just behavior, but the internals are also matching the brain as well as the brain matches itself. So that's the reason why it's called that. And so when we're kind of looking at brain data like this, so this is actually a rodent brain where people are now able to record from whole brain data while animals are performing behaviors using neuropixel probes. So they can record hundreds of thousands of units all at once. There's a big data problem. Like, how are we going to make sense of all of this data? And we're using neural networks really as our hypotheses. We're training them on tasks to do behaviors that we think the brain is doing, and then comparing them. And in particular, the way we're going to engage with whole brain data is really by building embodied agents and check if their internals pass the NeuroAI Turing test on this type of whole brain data. Okay, so that's going to be the procedure. And the way we're going to kind of approach this, the scientific question we're going after is like, how does the brain build and use world models? And we like to think of maybe world models as, at a minimum, maybe having 4 basic ingredients: representation, prediction, planning, and action. And you can kind of think of like an agent having this, very basic sensory motor loop that I'm just schematizing. So a perception module, the ability to predict future states of the environment, not just the current state, to then use that future inference to then plan actions and then execute them in a body. And we can kind of think of, and furthermore, there's intrinsic goals that are, of course, guiding this, which gets to the autonomy part. But basically, the idea is that each of these modules, which I'm color coding, can directly be mapped onto specific brain areas. So I'm just showing a rodent brain in particular, but you can imagine the perception module is mapping onto the visual system, future inference onto medial PFC, planning on HPC, and then motor in the motor cortex and cerebellum is just an illustrative example. But the nice thing is you're not tied to any one species. You can actually do cross-species comparisons, right? Sensory motor loops are conserved across species. Rodents do it, primates do it, we do it, flies do it. And so as we get more and more whole brain neural data across these species, we can actually start to have different embodied agents for each brain, and we can make these model brain comparisons and do these cross-species checks. So I'm going to start, basically this talk is going to build this agent out and maybe put in hypotheses at the end of like what we think might be going on. And I'll end those hypotheses with question marks, but I'll give you some data and evidence of why we might think that. So let's start with perception. One thing that was very common back in the day was that you would supervise on labels. So I talked about ImageNet categorization. You would have 1,000 categories. But you know, if you look at a baby, the way this is a time lapse of a baby exploring its environment. It's not like there's any kind of clear goal, and it's obviously not receiving very dense labels that are written in the sky. And same with this monkey, right? Definitely no language. So it's an effective proxy, but there's something deeply wrong with it as a supervision signal. And so about 5 years ago, there was contrastive learning, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where you try to make sure that different views of the same image are similar, and they're contrasted with different images. And they're somewhat inspired by how we sample the world via head motions, right? So if I look at this bottle from different views, I'm calling this the same bottle, and I'm going to contrast it with this cap, for example. And it turned out that actually these models that are trained with these contrastive losses, again, the same data set, end up matching, these contrastive objectives end up matching the neural predictivity of visual cortex as well as categorization optimized models. So in other words, they're a way of kind of like doing the same thing, but without the labels as well. A natural question is whether we can do even better than categorization in other species. So in non-human primates, you know, they're very object-oriented. So it seems like, you know, by doing this kind of contrastive learning, it's also trying to learn an object-centric-ish representation as a proxy for these semantic words for object categories. But for example, if we went to something like a mouse, one thing we see right off the bat is that mouse vision is actually less hierarchical than primate vision. So it's like you have V1, you have the primary visual area, and then a bunch of higher areas that are stretched out in parallel like a paw. And it turns out that actually, if you look at the individual predictivity of models that are trained with contrasted losses in red, for the same architecture-controlled model, what you see is across these visual areas, especially these higher visual areas, you see an improvement of the contrasted objective over the categorization optimized model. And in fact, for this particular data set, you're getting about 90% of the NeuroAI Turing test for this data. And so one thing we wanted to ask is, like, why might it be the case that the mouse visual system in particular is preferring this type of self-supervision than, say, like, not only supervision, but other loss functions like autoencoding, et cetera, which came before it. And the idea was that basically it's trying to learn as task general as a representation as it can, but with limited resources of a shallower cortex and lower visual acuity. And so the way we assess this is we actually took our optimized visual system, and then we actually embodied it in a virtual rodent body, which was developed by Ben Silvestri's group at Harvard. And then we trained a policy downstream after freezing the weights. So this is actually at the matched visual acuity of the rodent, and after it's been trained with our unsupervised visual system in this maze navigation task. So it's trained on ImageNet style images, but it's evaluated on a completely different maze environment. And what we saw is that in this high degree of freedom body, you basically got better transfer performance with the contrastive objective over the same supervised model with the exact same kind of constraints of a shallower architecture. And also likewise in other downstream tasks as well. So in other words, the contrastive objectives were enabling you to learn this kind of more task general representation. We can also ask, what about other sensory modalities beyond vision? So we actually had this work accepted as a NeuroAI, which was co-led by my master's student Trinity and Yuchen. And the idea was to kind of extend these ideas into the somatosensory domain, into tactile processing. So you might ask, why tactile? Well, tactile data is, of course, very useful in manipulating occluded scenes and out-of-distribution objects. In robotics, this is currently understudied, but it's getting much better and better. So Trinity did a search on archives and found that there's far less tactile papers than vision papers. So it's a good time to be doing it. A lot of tactile processing is actually vision-based. So you have something like a gel site where you press it, and it's a depth camera that you get out of it. And it's not like the exploratory signals we get with our fingertips, which are real-time courses and torques. Yeah, something like this. And so our hypothesis, again, kind of in line with contravariance, was that as model architectures did better at tactile processing with real force and torque inputs, they would also be better brain-like models. And so we generated a large-scale whisking data set where Mitra Hartman's group at Northwestern actually had this simulator of a real whisker, and then we had all these objects that we got past it and recorded the forces and torques across them as input. So these are inputs to our model. So it's not depth camera images, but it's the real as real as we could get it in a sim. And it turned out that actually to do effective contrastive self-supervised learning, you needed custom augmentations as well that were different than the traditional image-based ones. There's always a bar plot that shows the thing you did is better than yeah, anyway. Okay, so the encoder attender decoder architecture was something we looked at as a way to search through models. So we had both recurrent models at the bottom here, but also feed-forward models, S4. So the idea is that this class of convolutional light-style models are better at kind of the high-dimensional inputs that you get. And then the attention-like models like Mamba or GPT are better at after you've kind of processed things through a few layers of nonlinearity to then be able to decode it out into either a contrastive loss or a categorization objective from that tactile input. And actually, we have it available now, which is cool. So check it out. But anyway, once we did this kind of large-scale model architecture search, what we found ultimately was that when we looked at a large range of models at tactile categorization performance, oftentimes the choice of encoder really mattered. So S4 encoders had a lot of trouble with this particular task, but feed-forward models trained okay. But the best models overall all were recurrent models with an attender plus a supervised decoder. It's one of the few times where I've seen a recurrent model actually do better than a feed-forward one, which just suggests because this task is actually very temporal. And furthermore, what we did is that we actually compared these past optimized models to real responses that were available a couple of years ago from rodent visual cortex, the part of the brain of the rodent that actually processes these inputs, where they had the rodent actually whisk convex and concave objects at differing distances. And we tried to simulate this in sim where the whiskers are actually actively whisking the objects they're in, and those are providing the new sources of validation input. So these are objects that it hasn't seen in ShapeNet before, and in an active rather than passive whisk. And what we see is that when we compare we can look at the neural fit of all the models we task trained. We didn't fit it to the neural data. We just look at the representations. The NeuroAI Turing test for this data is about 1.3 or so, and our models are basically approaching, our best models are approaching it there. But the main takeaway is that we've nearly passed it. We would like to have more stimuli to evaluate with. Convarnans outperform feed-forward models on realistic tactile recognition, but they also best match neural responses in mouse neural cortex. So they don't only do the task better, but they actually end up being a better neural model of tactile processing. And furthermore, that the contrasted objectives match the supervised objective, and much better than say things like autoencoding. So you still need a strong self-supervised learner, just like we get in vision. Okay, so maybe the conclusion of this section is, as we're looking across these modalities and species, that it's some kind of low-level recurrence plus what seems to consistently really matter, though, especially is this contrastive self-supervised objective. What about prediction? So this was work I did a couple years ago when I was a postdoc. The brain data was collected in primates this time by Rishi Radulingam. And the basic idea is that we do a lot more than just like single pass visual processing or sensory processing in general. So for example, if I show you this picture of the ice block on the right versus the one on the left, you can kind of infer that this one has been out longer by your understanding of the dynamics of temperature and the environment. My cat will predict whether this box will support her before she gets on. And just by looking at this picture, I can also start to plan intervening actions of how I might take these hats off a rack, right? So these go beyond just like what's in the image itself to kind of simulating what might happen. And of course, this is not restricted to static scenes. So if I show you this video of a fluid hitting an unknown object, you could probably readily infer that it was a staircase, right? Just as though it was actually there. And so the kind of puzzle here was what might be the constraints that enable us to predict the future state of our environment across diverse settings. And so we looked at a bunch of models. I'll make a note that one of the models we looked at was these kinds of like encoder decoder generative models. Of the scaled up version was the one I showed you in the beginning with for example, Sora, where you have a very photorealistic output. You're trying to predict the next frame, and you're trying to produce a very your loss is across all of the pixels. And so you're penalized if your prediction is also not photorealistic. We also compared models that had explicit object slots as one hypothesis. The main one I'm gonna focus on, at least for this part of the presentation, is what I'm calling latent future prediction. And I'll explain in a minute, but at a high level, basically all we're doing is we're training these video prediction models on large-scale data sets. And then what we're doing is we're holding their weights fixed, just like we've done in all the other neural evaluations, and evaluating them on held out both human behavior predictions of whether objects will come into contact or not, as well as looking at the internals of these models and seeing if they actually match brain areas in primates where it's been shown that they actually predict the future state of their environment. So Rishi trained monkeys to play a game of Pong, where the trick was that as the ball was about to hit the joystick, it was occluded from view. And so in order to play the game well, I had to actually simulate the ball. And they actually could find that despite the ball being hidden from view, there was a simulation of the ball's position and velocity in this area, dorsal medial frontal cortex. So that's the area that we're going to also compare the internals of the models to. And so this is the reason I'm highlighting this model is because it's actually the best one. And the basic idea was rather than posit some kind of explicit representation like slots or penalize the model for doing kind of a very photorealistic, non-photorealistic prediction, when what we care about is like more physically realistic predictions, is we're going to try to start with a video foundation model and then future predict, hold this fixed, and then future predict the next frame in that latent space. And so a natural question is like, what vision task should you pre-train on? And up until now, everything I've shown you has just been with static images, right? And images from ImageNet, for example, which end up actually being inadequate for this task. But luckily, at the time when I started this, Ego 4D had just come out. So this is where participants wear head-mounted cameras and then just do everyday actions around the world. And you can train with the same exact contrastive objective that I've shown you thus far, but just in time with frames. And what people showed was that these ended up being at least better, not perfect, but better foundation models for held-out embodied tasks compared to, say, static image optimized models. And in fact, what we found was something similar held true as well, where if we looked at the internals of these task-optimized models, these feature predictors, it was the video foundation models that were approaching the variability of the neurons that was relevant for mental simulation. That's what this dotted line means. And they're getting about 90% of this line. And these do much better, about twice as much better than all of the image foundation models, even the models that are not only trained on ImageNet, but much larger, like 400 times larger web scale data sets. And what's interesting is that large scale pre-training isn't enough. If you can compare the neural predictivity of models that are just trained on Ego 4D versus those that have this latent future predictor on top, And there's a dramatic difference in their ability to do this prediction problem as well of real neural activity. So you need both. You have the scale, that's the starting point, but then you're leveraging it to do this kind of explicit feature prediction. The other thing was we said, look, we have like human data and we care about humans in terms of like their abilities. Is there a model that kind of straddles both? Is there a kind of a shared substrate between what the primates can do and what the humans can do? The trade-off is, of course, with the primate data, you get very detailed neural recordings, but it's a simpler task. Whereas with humans, you can do like large-scale, harder 3D tasks, but the readout is, of course, lower dimensional. It's just yes or no. And so because of the trade-offs of each, we were like, was there a model that does one well? It turned out that the latent feature prediction model that was exposed to the largest variety of egocentric video sources that transferred the best was also the one that straddled both the best in held out evaluations. But I would argue that, you know, we haven't solved this data, like especially with human behavior. I think there's a ways to go to get to better models, and we can talk about that offline. But I just want to flag that. Okay, so maybe the picture so far is for the feature inference module, it's some kind of latent feature prediction with a contrastive loss that we're inheriting from vision, right, from this prior module. So what about planning and action? So I'm going to lump these together because they end up being highly related, as you'll see in a minute. Just to begin with, we can talk about a little bit about planning. So what I'm showing you here is a top-down view of a rat just going around in its environment, foraging for food. And these red dots are spiking activity in its brain as it's doing so in its hippocampus. And what you see is that, here, I can play again, is that as it navigates this environment, the hippocampal place cells actually fire in particular locations as it enters particular locations. So in other words, this part of the brain, its hippocampus, is actually representing space. It's like creating a kind of GPS. And this was actually given the Nobel Prize in like 2014 for this type of work of what they call a cognitive map is the other word for it. And it's not just place cells in the hippocampus that matter, but there's also place cells in the grid cells and border cells and heterogeneous cells that are in another brain area that's connected to it called medial entorhinal cortex. And so grid cells are very, like, at least in neuroscience, they're very famous cells because they have very periodic hexagonal firing fields as a function of space. So they fire in a very regular and interpretable way, and people have studied them for ages. And furthermore, there's other cells that are really interpretable as a function of space. So there's cells that actually fire at environmental boundaries. So if an animal is in a box, it's going to fire at one of the four corners. But one thing I'll highlight is that these are really just a fraction of the entire entorhinal cortex. So grid cells are about like the ones that look pretty. This is from real data. I made this, so it's not made up. It's like real. But the amount of cells that look like this is about 2 to 3%, and it's about like 10 to 12% border cells. But a large fraction of cells are heterogeneous, and they look very blobby and weird. Like they're not very interpretable as a function of space, and they represent multiple kinds of navigational variables, not just position, but heading direction, velocity, the linear combinations of those, and many more. And so for a long time, people were kind of, there's a little bit of like a weird conundrum because everyone is kind of focused on these cells because they're nice and human language interpretable, but they're really like, there's all this dark matter, basically, that people wanted to engage with. And so we had work many more than a few years ago showing that if you did a type of path integration with at least in this case, a recurrent network where you're integrating velocities to get positions, you could actually recover the exact distribution actually of all of these cells. So you're just doing a task like this. You're not fitting them to this distribution at all. But after the fact, you're just looking at the distributions of the internal units. And it turns out that it's a type of task optimization called path integration. But in particular, the thing you can ask yourself is, well, you can't just supervise on position because how does the animal get X, Y position? It's not like, again, no one's in the sky writing X and Y. Here's where you are. The animal has to estimate it. And the animal is estimating this from the place cells that we were looking at just a few slides ago. So actually, it turns out it's quite critical that this is the objective function. You actually optimize across through real Gaussian place fields to get this entire distribution back, basically. So again, it's the same thing that's showing up from vision and tactile processing and future prediction of task optimization, but just which objective is what we're trying to narrow down. Okay. So going from this kind of cognitive map that I was just talking about to enabling action with intrinsic goals, right? So this is work that is going to appear in NeurIPS this year, which was led by my student Reese Keller, who's co-advised with Zach Pitko, along with great work from Lynn and Felix, and was actually Leo and I started this, but very briefly towards the end of our postdoc. So it was great to see it come together like this. And the basic idea, as I showed you, is that basically, again, this baby doesn't have any goals, right? So one of the issues with kind of the standard way we think about things is that we have some objective and we're trying to optimize it. And that's everything I've kind of told you thus far, is there's this kind of task objective that we're trying to get better at. But how do we formalize this, right? Like, what does success mean for this baby, right? It's really just exploring its environment, touching it, building a model of the world, etc. So that's like the AI side of things. The neuro side of things is that, we've primarily looked at task-dependent behavior, right? We overtrain an animal to do this one task, like mental Pong, by depriving it of food, and then getting it to do it really well, and it does it for thousands of trials. But this kind of unconstrained behavior is something that we're now able to get access to because we can do these kind of chronic recordings in real brains. But we've kind of ignored this kind of task-independent autonomous behavior. And we often attribute intelligence to things like this, where someone has a goal and they're doing really hard problems with it. And so unlike games where, say, RL has traditionally succeeded, the environment doesn't just give you a dense reward function, just like it doesn't give you labels for the objects in your environment. You have to kind of internally somehow generate them as an organism. And so one kind of neat organism whose brain we can kind of look into is known as the larval zebrafish. So this was work that was done by Misha Arens at Janelia, where they basically have a zebrafish that they're imaging. And the nice thing is, because it's a larva, its skull is transparent. And so as it's moving, basically, its motor output is actually used to steer a kind of virtual reality, like these stripes that are being shown here. And so it kind of satisfies nice desired data. It's large scale. You can record from hundreds of thousands of units. And as it's kind of doing this task, one thing that's interesting is that if you close the loop, if you break this loop and the animal feels like its movements are no longer leading to real change in its virtual environment, it actually ends up giving up. And then it starts again. So it's called futility-induced passivity. And in fact, what's kind of interesting is that you can image. So this is actually the real brain of the zebrafish lighting up across its population of both neurons and a special kind of cell called radial astrocytes. And so they can image the whole brain like this during this kind of very reasonably ethological behavior. So there's been so now kind of bouncing back to the machine autonomy side, there's been lots of prior work kind of doing this kind of intrinsically motivated work, including work at CMU here. And this has typically been applied to things like Atari, Mario Kart, control environments. But oftentimes, you don't really care about ethology here, but if we wanted to train this kind of swimmer agent, you can kind of reward hack by kind of putting kind of random inputs with these types of reward functions. And it scores high on it because it's exploring its environment technically, but it's not really usefully swimming forward in any meaningful way. The other aspect of these kind of more information theoretic measures, like surprisal, is that if I turn this screen into white noise, from an information theoretic point of view, it's great. But from a organism ethology point of view, it's pretty boring, and you should kind of get tired of it, basically. And these animals give up, right? But you don't see that with these kinds of objectives. Okay. So anyway, our basic approach was to incorporate priors. So basically that you have some kind of ethological memory, so a fixed or slowly adapting dynamics prior, e.g. a world model, and then it can compute the mismatch with its sensory motor feedback. And so I'll go through this quickly, but the basic idea was we wanted to build a convincing model of this fish, and explore this question of what the intrinsic drive could be that could explain this behavior. So we actually embodied it in a virtual zebrafish whose skin was designed by Aran. And we wanted to basically actuate it as realistically as we could. So this is as best as we could recapitulate the real experimenter's stimulus set that they actually showed the real zebrafish. And then we could actually go and compare the internals of this zebrafish to real data. And so this is how our model looks like. Has a world model, and it has an intrinsic drive that's then basically comparing its ability to do so well with the predicted mismatch when it's in the new setting. So, for example, if the world model of the agent is to move forward and it understands those dynamics, that's its prior, and then we're computing the progressive disagreement across time in the new setting where it's no longer able to do that well. And so recall there's a connection to that in the memory I was just talking about earlier. And so when we put this all together, we get an agent that gets embodied like this, and it emits a set of activity inside its head that we can actually compare to real zebrafish data. And actually what we find is that our method of 3M progress seems to best match not only the whole brain data of the larval zebrafish, but also its the different cell types, and also matches the ethology, the actual behavior as well, compared to the other kind of intrinsic curiosity methods. Okay, so maybe the last thing here is like some kind of temporal integration of world model progress-based curiosity. So I'm putting these in question marks because, at the end of the day, these are just, neural data is just becoming more and more popular. And so we'll see, how much of this picture holds. But as far as we can sort of ascertain, this is kind of the best thing we're able to see, and trying to see what you can see it's very self-consistent. You have the contrastive objective that kind of comes through into the world model that produces a latent state, and then the intrinsic goals are leveraging that world model and that memory to then compute that kind of expected mismatch. Just to end, I thought I'd mention something, about safety very briefly, which is that as we start to build more and more capable autonomous agents, right? In this case, the autonomy isn't like doing a useful task. It's just trying to impinge on something about how maybe we explore our environments and gain better data online. But an actual question is, of course, as these agents start to give rise to stronger capabilities, are there things we should be wary of or be aware of as a function of capability? So I don't mean safety as a function of things failing. If an elevator fails, that's unsafe. But what I mean as safety as a function of capability. One thing you can show, and so this is more theoretical work, is that if you have too many of these intrinsic goals, by the way, alignment itself can become intractable, even for computationally unbounded agents. One can specify a kind of like small value set of this type that guarantees what's known as corrigibility under an optimal policy, where basically the agent isn't, I'm sure some of you heard of paperclip maximization, where, if an agent optimizes paperclips, then it might kind of like take over the world because that helps maximize its objective. With corrigibility, what we want is that it still defers to, say, humans, for example, but still optimizes its policy, but the task optimization doesn't overtake the, let's say, loss of control that we're talking about. And this is nice and modular, kind of parallel. Maybe the theme that you're also seeing is that we're doing everything kind of modularly. So there's a kind of theme there as like an inductive bias that circumvents that barrier. An interesting question is, can we scale this corrigibility cost effectively, which is an open question. And the reason for this is that, I'll just briefly mention this, is that this is my last slide. If you wanted to look at, suppose that basically we looked at AI capability as a function of time. As it got better and better, there comes a point where you can study kind of the economics of it, where this kind of dotted line is representing where you could, say, fund a universal basic income. Now, a natural question is like whether you would want that, but you can compute a kind of closed form threshold as a function of capability that could fund this kind of very basic income. And one kind of factor, this depends on multiple factors. One is that if the costs of alignment are actually high, one of the reasons why you care about scalability or cost effectiveness is that this will increase this threshold even more. So if, for example, alignment costs exceed a certain amount, then this threshold won't be feasible at all anymore. An interesting open question is, of course, the UBI doesn't lead to long-term human well-being. Are there other values besides loss of control that we can incorporate into AI agents later on in the future in the intrinsic goals? Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to thank my lab, without whom this work wouldn't be possible, as well as my funding sources. And we just recently got a little lab logo. But thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Question down here.
Hello, thank you for this really interesting talk. Brains are plastic, and we know that people who lose certain brain areas can recover that functionality in other brain areas. How is that represented in your model, or do you think that these models need to adopt plasticity in order to fully represent human brain health?
That's a great question. Yeah. In these models, we're not looking at that kind of well, so in some sense, the last part, the autonomy part, is getting to that online learning aspect of things and adaptation, but really right now I would say at a minimal level. A lot of it was, this kind of pre-training of these individual modules just to get to the adult state of the animal. And then we're comparing end states rather than, say, developmental trajectories. But one thing that I think is quite interesting is that the only way you can get at this question of computationally what's going on in the brain as it's, say, recovering from injury or just learning a new skill, right, even in a healthy brain, is you need a kind of agent, because the kind of traditional way we used to do these model brain comparisons, we trained it on a task and then we just evaled it, with the weights mix. But there you're not making a specific commitment to where does evolution end, which is the pre-training stage, and where does online learning begin. Whereas with an agent, you actually have to make that commitment, because you're okay, well, the modules start at this state, and then you could literally do an experiment where you're showing, okay, the modules are actually mapping onto the brain at the state before injury, or say before skill learning, new skill learning, and then you posit real online learning rules, and then compare that trajectory of activities to try to see which rule is most consistent with what would be the underlying plasticity rule that's giving rise to that capability. And I think that's actually the learning rule, which is kind of the fourth ingredient in task outcomes learning, was kind of something I shoved under the rug. It's, I think, probably the hardest one, right? If you look at a brain, there's lots of scales of complexity. But the architecture, how things are wired, you can get a rough sense just by literally looking at a brain, right? And people did envision, right? For example, Kuval and Weasel with the cat V1, which then little CNN. But when it comes to the task, the objective function that you train on, for the most part, you just look at how animals behave. You're well, we got to do that, right? But the learning rules is black box. How is it actually doing that? And I think that's where you need an agent to really reverse engineer it, because it's unclear. There's so many things going on there that it's, without a hypothesis going in, it's very hard to back it out. You have to go and try it out and then compare it to real data. A related question is, of course, what you should measure in the brain to do that. And so we had some work showing that if you track activities, the output responses of neurons rather than the weights, of course, if you track the weights, you can infer the learning rule. But if you track the output activities, you can do a pretty good job. And that's a much easier experiment. So it's feasible in principle. It just requires a lot of work, but you need an agent, I think, for that.
I have a question. All right, so in robotics, most of the time what we do as engineers is we say, man, I really want my robot to do some tasks. For example, I'm just trying to get an RC car to move from point A to point B. What I do is I write down a state space. Maybe I have a high fidelity simulator. Maybe I write down a dynamic model, and I do optimization with that, right? That's my world model. That's my representation. But then maybe sometimes I'm I actually want to do drifting with this car. Okay, so now I need a higher order model to be able to actually control it to do drifting. And then you're oh, actually now I want, my robot to do something else. And so every single time I sit down to make my robot do a task, I have to commit to a particular sufficient representation of the world and a corresponding forward model. What is your hypothesis for what either natural agents or maybe eventually what our embodied agents should do in order to construct a sufficient representation of the world in a corresponding model for all of these possible things it might do? How is that working out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a very deep one too. So I would say maybe, I mean, I think to me the answer is unclear, but I can tell you more of what doesn't work.
Okay. Save us some time.
Yeah. No, I mean, so as I mentioned, kind of in the world modeling section, I mentioned that like the best model we had thus far was this kind of video foundation model, gives you a latent, and then you feed to predict in that latent space. And it was quite crucial that it was a video foundation model, not an image. Okay. But when it came to like comparing to human error patterns, those models still were below the human to human ceiling. So in other words, like humans were still better at a lot of physical judgments, but not when. So what was interesting was when you look at the category of judgments that models fail at, but humans do well on. Models are actually quite good at rigid contact, but when it came to things like cloth, or so it's like this object kind of draping over even a solid object, for example. Even just doing the object contact prediction there for these models out of distribution wasn't great. And in fact, you could say, well, I don't know, like maybe clock was out of distribution, but that's not true because, maybe to some extent it is, but there's lots of soft objects in Eagle 4D. There's like clay, there's like people like working with in their kitchens, and there's lots of squishy things, different material properties. So in some sense, like the statistical learning of getting that latent is not picking up on diversity of object properties or material properties as much as it could be. So it like
how much do you think like you need more sensing modalities? Like if I trained my video prediction model with the tactile data, for example, that you collected, or heat data that I have, like if I just show like as an embodied agent, I'm not just a video prediction model, right? Like I have proprioception, I have force, all this other stuff. Do you think is that the like right self-supervision kind of here for shaping the representation, or you still don't know?
I think so that was certainly after doing this, I was like, oh, well, then maybe we should go to Tactile. And so that's what motivated going there to like just even understand computationally what we're dealing with here. And it seemed like we needed to do a few things with self-supervised learning there, but it's still like, putting that into hand and all that is like an interesting question. And so I agree, like that could help, but I'm not certain if, I think interaction would be useful, and multimodal interaction, which is I think what you're getting at, is useful. I wonder if maybe there is also an improved kind of inductive bias when you get there. Maybe not. My null hypothesis is no, right? Just to be conservative about it. But it would be interesting if it turned out that I think the first step is always don't throw everything out. First, do the kind of thing that seems to make sense. So add more modalities. But I also wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't enough. And then it totally is a very strong case. Like, okay, then we should be thinking about, I don't know. One idea was like maybe some interface between. So people always talk about neurosymbolic models, and I remember working with those types of models in the past, and it was just so hard to trade. And yeah, you made an interesting point about, well, how do you deal with models that deal with different material properties? Well, in physics simulators, you just have different equations, so you don't really. But in our like heads, we have the same kind of substrate that's dealing with all of them, and so I think the crazy hypothesis is maybe you need something in intermediary. So it's like not not totally unlearned, and not only learned with like just a dense vector, but something in between, and I don't know, maybe dynamic object slots or something. But I think that's the less clear question, but we should evaluate that if the multimodal thing doesn't work.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. I have a question specifically about representations and alignment with like how the brain works. I can had a slide on video models doing better than image models for these tasks, and specifically also you talked about how like any video models for like next part prediction was helpful. So I guess the question is twofold. So first, like I think a lot of people nowadays are working on autoregressive video models or video models that kind of autoregressively predict the future, both for like streaming purposes and just gonna say communication. So do you think those would perform better? And then also I think here was a slide on like you want to say I have an image, like how can I like get this part and like the image, or how can I eat this in the image? So to me that like screens or like seems like VLMs would also be a very interesting baseline for how well their representations matter. So for instance, like maybe you put an image, you say what should I do next, and then look at those representations. Like I guess the meta question is like, is the auto-regressiveness more important, or just like the more data that like the video model sees in the representation more important, or is it still kind of open?
I think it's somewhat open. I would say that from what I've seen, the video part mattered a lot more than anything else. Because like you could compare to like image foundation models that were trained on massive amounts of web scale images, and actually you got more bang for your buck with Ego 4D as the modality. So I think that's certainly, like, in other words, like it's sort of like the boring answer, like, okay, if you give it, in retrospect, it's kind of the boring answer of like, okay, if you give it the same stream that you and I deal with, it's going to just do better at the thing we expect it should do better at. Whether or not the auto-regressive aspect of it, I think that's an interesting question. I know some people like strong opinions that, oh, auto-regressive is a failure, but I don't know. I think we should see it, but I suspect that the data modality first and then the architecture second. We'll see. Makes sense. Thanks, Nick.
大家好，hi, the sample for your organization from Mama Honorary. The same question about the video condition models, and even there are some 3D or 4D scene generation. Yeah, I was wondering, will this better performance like better similar to what our NeuroAI is doing? Because it so maybe had like somehow 3D speedborn images and the video.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think that's related to this kind of meta point of like, you want, I mean, we don't know until we try it, but I expect that's more in the right direction, because, the name of the game is like, get as close to what you and I actually deal with as much as possible. So going from images to videos, I imagine going from videos to 3D will matter to an extent. And if this is kind of in line with that contravariance principle that I was mentioning, where it's like, I do train on harder tasks, but they have to be ecologically relevant. So for example, like if I train my, you and I aren't very good at barcode reading, actually. But like, and if we trained an amazing barcode reader, it's going to be a terrible model of our visual system. It's a hard task on its own in some sense, but it's not ethologically relevant. So it's like going in more in that direction of like what you and I deal with naturally is almost guaranteed to give you a better brain model. The question is to what degree, to like how much better, and you can control for it by like, keeping the architecture fixed and varying the tasks. But also having, my other argument is that you also want the brain data, the target brain data, to not be on this kind of contrived overtrained task that you're getting an animal to do, but just to be as naturalistic and free as possible, because that's kind of where you start to see all the interesting stuff unfold, right? Because if you overtrain it on like matching a dot, okay, but there's like not going to be much to do there cognitively that's going on. It doesn't need to use much of its brain power to do that. But if it has to deal with this full range of an environment, then it starts to become an interesting target.
Yeah, sense.
We have time for maybe one more. If there's any last questions?
We last.
I'm genuinely questions out. Is there any reason apart from ethical reasons or cost reduction to reverse engineer? Like, is there any like direct to reverse engineer natural intelligence to apart from cost reduction of simulating natural behaviors, and also just like ethical reasons, like instead of experiment you want to add like this, like apart from those reasons, do you see like a very interesting reason for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I guess, okay, I should say like when I started in this intersection, this was like around, and like maybe ImageNet was like starting to become more popular and all of that. And I think for a long time, we didn't have good models of the brain because we just didn't have good models of like anything intelligent to begin with. And then like, and in neuroscience, on one hand, like they're very focused on like one specific task that's repeatable, but it's just not, from an intelligence point of view, it's not that, it's like in some sense not that interesting, but that's not the point. Their point is like, brains are stochastic. It's so hard to set up my experiment. Like I just want this reliable thing to publish my Nature paper that gives me this like specific answer about how this one circuit like works in comparison to the other. And, of course you're going to get low dimensional readouts when your task is low dimensional. In fact, there's even theoretical work that showed that the complexity of the neural population activity actually scales with the complexity of the tasks to do that. And so more broadly, I think like the point I'm making is that like what I find particularly interesting is that I think of this as kind of not just like neuroscience and AI and cognitive science, but really like a more unified, I think, like scientific understanding of intelligence. Because like it turns out that you don't have to go and like match every circuit like by hand in the brain to like build a brain-like model. It's actually by virtue of doing an interesting AI task that we ultimately want to as a goal, that we as a byproduct in a lot of cases get a brain-like model. So it shows that the two are kind of like related in an interesting way, not just in a kind of ex post facto way. Yeah.
Amazing. Let's thank our speaker one more time.